Today, we're told a story repeated in schools, media, and pop culture. A story that paints early British settlers to Australia as invaders, conquerors, and genocidal oppressors. A people who came to exterminate the Aboriginal Australians and steal their land by force. This modern narrative claims that the colonization was a one-sided campaign of brutality driven by racism and greed, erasing thousands of years of culture in the process. But what if that's not the whole truth? What if the men and women who first stepped off the ships in 1788 were not bloodthirsty murderers, but ordinary, good people? Some of them convicts, but others settlers with an honest desire to build a new society, who carried the values of Christian morality and British legal order. And what if the very foundation of Australia was laid not with conquest, but with caution, diplomacy, and attempts at peaceful coexistence? We're not saying that no violence occurred, but we are going to look factually at why things occurred, and in this video, we'll completely dismantle the modern myth of colonial genocide with documented history, facts, and direct quotes. We'll begin with the very first landing in 1788 and examine the writings, orders, and actions of early settlers. We'll look at recorded killings, including the infamous 1838 Myall Creek event, and reveal what the public and state response to that was and why. And we'll ask the hard questions. Who really started the violence? What motivated the worst acts? And is the truth being buried today?
To support us, consider becoming a YouTube channel member or Patreon, or check out our new merch line, links in the description below.
When Captain Arthur Phillip sailed to Botany Bay in January 1788, he did not arrive with an army to conquer a people. He arrived with a mission to relieve the overcrowded prisons of England and to establish a penal colony, not a kingdom of bloodshed. Philip's instructions from King George III were not to engage in hostilities, but to treat the Aboriginal people with kindness and to avoid conflict wherever possible. In fact, Philip is famously recorded saying, "There can be no slavery in a free land, and consequently no slaves." He believed in humane treatment and issued strict orders that the Aboriginal people were not to be harmed unless in direct self-defense, and that there would be punishment for people who would do otherwise. Early settler diaries and journals reflect this cautious, respectful approach. The first years of colonization were marked by efforts to trade, communicate, and understand. Philip himself tried to learn local languages and even had two Aboriginal men, Bennelong and Colby, brought into the British camp very early on, not as prisoners, but as cultural ambassadors. He dined with them, gave them gifts, and even built a brick hut for Bennelong on what is now Sydney Harbour. Philip was also quoted saying to live in amity and kindness with them, so as to cultivate an acquaintance with them without their having an idea of our great superiority over them. And another early famous governor, Lachlan Macquarie, expressed the wish that, quote, "natives of this country may always be treated with kindness and attention," end quote. The settlers, largely convicts, were undernourished, sickly, and ill-equipped to survive at some stages early on, let alone to wage a war of extermination. Their greatest threats were starvation and disease, not Aboriginal resistance. They built tents and crusade huts from the earth, relying heavily on their Christian chaplains for hope, guidance, and community cohesion. But despite these peaceful beginnings, tensions did emerge eventually. Misunderstandings around land, hunting rights, and cultural norms caused conflict. While settlers saw land as something to be farmed and fenced, Aboriginal people viewed it as communal and sacred. These worldviews clashed, sometimes fatally. Yet to say this early period was defined by mass slaughter is extremely dishonest. The records don't show calculated extermination or crazy amounts of mass killings. They show sporadic, tragic incidents where Aboriginal clans would attack settlers and their families, and individual settlers retaliating out of self-defense or fear, ending up with deaths on both sides. It was far from state-sanctioned genocide. Indeed, Phillip himself was speared in the shoulder by an Aboriginal in 1790, and he didn't even respond with revenge. Instead, he forgave. His approach remained clear: peace over retribution. Even when the settlers were killed in frontier skirmishes, official policy by the state and governors in charge resisted calls for a widespread military response. Let's be clear. Had the British wanted to wipe out the Aboriginal people, they definitely had the firepower to do it. But there was no war campaign and no order to destroy. Rather, there was hesitancy, legal restraint, and the influence of Christian morality. And if another nation had colonized Australia, let's say the Chinese or Japanese, then it would be probably likely that the Aboriginal people wouldn't even exist today. It's important to remember that this was a Christian civilization entering a tribal land, not a militarized empire looking for conquest. Australia's founding DNA was rooted in Christian law, British fairness, and the hope for peaceful coexistence. To understand the violent conflicts between early settlers and Aboriginal Australians, we must begin with one simple truth. The British did not arrive in Australia with the intent to commit genocide, as we've already stated. They came to build a new life, to settle, to farm, to establish a society rooted in British law and Christian order. Yet violence did occur. But the question is not whether violence happened, it's why it happened. From the earliest years of settlement, tensions flared. The British brought livestock, built fences, and cleared land, which clashed with the nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle of the Indigenous peoples. Small areas of land that were previously used for seasonal hunting or tribal movement suddenly became enclosed for crops or grazing. Misunderstandings were inevitable, and those misunderstandings sometimes turned violent, but not one-sidedly. Records show that Aboriginal attacks began within the first few years of settlement. Convicts and settlers were speared while working alone, livestock were speared or driven off, crops were raided or destroyed as Indigenous groups didn't recognize private property in a European or civilized sense. In response, some settlers retaliated, not out of racial bloodlust, but out of fear and a desire to defend their families, property, and survival. Reprisals came after women or children were attacked or raped, shepherds were killed, or entire herds of sheep were stolen. In many cases, the British delayed action until repeated incidents forced their hand. This wasn't genocide, it was frontier conflict. The kind of clashes seen anywhere in the world when two civilizations collide over land and resources. It's crucial to note that many settlers actually tried to avoid conflict. There were government orders from as early as the 1970s discouraging indiscriminate violence. Governors like Macquarie and Phillip issued the explicit instructions for peaceful coexistence, as we quoted earlier, and actually punishment for any unjustified killings, and even rewards for friendly relations. Yes, there were tragic events. Yes, people got killed on both sides. But the truth is far more complex than the modern myth of settlers simply marching in with guns and wiping out Aboriginal communities unprovoked and almost for sport or fun. The early years of settlement were marked not with imperial conquest, but by struggle to survive, to coexist, and to build something lasting in a harsh and unfamiliar land. And that truth deserves to be remembered. Today, it's so common to hear sweeping claims that the British colonisation of Australia was an act of systemic genocide, a deliberate government-backed attempt to wipe out the Aboriginal people. But this narrative simply does not hold up to historical scrutiny. There was never any official policy, military, governmental, or otherwise, aimed at exterminating Indigenous Australians. None. And one event that proves the falsity of the genocide claims is the 1838 Myall Creek Massacre. In this case, 11 settlers were tried, convicted, and publicly hanged for the brutal killings of unarmed Aboriginal people. This wasn't covered up. This wasn't brushed aside. It was punished by the colonial legal system itself. Now, there was some public outcry after this, with some people believing that the executions were excessive, but the governor and the judiciary made a clear statement. The law applies to everyone, including whites who commit violence against Aboriginal people. If systemic genocide had been the goal, these men would have been praised, not hung. What this reveals is the opposite of genocide. It reveals a fledgling society striving towards justice and order. It shows that even in a time of tension and fear, Christian moral norms and the rule of law still shape decisions. To reduce Australia's colonial story to one of unprovoked ethnic cleansing is to erase this nuance and the truth. It replaces evidence with modern ideology, and it dishonors both the victims of real violence and the men and women who stood for justice and their families when it counted the most. While modern narratives often highlight Aboriginal suffering, the violence and trauma experienced by early British settlers is almost completely erased from contemporary discussions. Yet history shows that many settlers, including women and children, lived in constant fear for their lives. Attacks were not abstract or occasional. They were brutal, felt personal, and very real. Settlers were speared while sleeping in their huts, ambushed while tending to crops, or assaulted while traveling alone. There were recorded instances of women being brutally raped, and even children as well, being kidnapped, raped, or killed during these raids. Entire homesteads were set on fire, livestock slaughtered, and property destroyed. These were not isolated incidents. They were sustained patterns of violence in certain regions, particularly along the ever-moving frontier. But because they do not fit the modern ideological narrative of the Indigenous one-sided oppression, they are ignored or rationalized. The Black Wars of the 1820s and 1830s in Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania, are often painted as genocide, yet when we examine the reality on the ground, they appear far more like escalating tit-for-tat conflicts. An Aboriginal clan would spear a settler's animal or kill an isolated person, labourer, and in response, the settlers would organise retaliatory actions, some of which may have been overboard, but the cycle spun back and forth, tragic and possibly avoidable, but far more complex than a deliberate extermination campaign from the colonizers. Settlers' diaries and letters, first-hand accounts, tell us a lot about this period. These are not the writings of imperial conquerors with bloodlust, they are the words of struggling farmers, fearful mothers, and disillusioned pioneers. Many express deep sadness over the state of affairs, some even admiration for the Aboriginal skills or concern for their survival, but most of all, these writings show fear. Fear of living isolated, surrounded by bushland, never knowing if the next spear would come through the window or if they would be raped, for the children and women in particular. This suffering deserves recognition, not denial. To focus only on Aboriginal deaths while ignoring settlers' loss is to rewrite history through a political lens. It creates a distorted morality where only one group's pain is acknowledged and the other is hidden. Amidst the hardship and bloodshed, there was also light. It came through the tireless work of Christian missionaries. Far from being agents of imperialism or oppression, these men and women genuinely believed that they were bringing peace, literacy, medicine, and eternal hope to Aboriginal Australians. They didn't carry rifles or build prisons. They carried Bibles, opened schools, and translated scripture into native languages. One such missionary was Lancelot Threlkeld, who spent decades working with the Awabakal people near modern-day Newcastle. He didn't just evangelize, he preserved Aboriginal language, advocated for their rights, and denounced violence against them. His legacy is one of peacemaking and protection, not conquest. Another key figure was William Walker, who ran the Wellington Valley Mission in New South Wales. His journals show a deep compassion for Aboriginal children in particular. He documented cases of exploitation and abuse among the Indigenous communities, particularly in relation to children sexually and physically, but remained committed to providing education, shelter, and dignity to these communities. Missions like his were often underfunded and isolated, but they continued out of love and duty. Many Aboriginal people did, in fact, respond very positively to these efforts. Some became Christian converts, not out of coercion, but out of conviction. They learned to read and write, shared the gospel with others, and even stood up against tribal violence and their spiritual practices, which, from a Christian point of view, are demonic and involved with engaging with demons, whereas an atheist point of view would claim it as superstition. These Indigenous Christians are rarely mentioned today, likely because they challenged the victim-only narrative often imposed on Aboriginal history. But they were real, courageous, and worthy of respect. Modern critics, particularly secular activists, often mock or condemn the mission movement as cultural imperialism, but this is a lazy and cynical view. While not perfect, these missions from settlers treated Aboriginal people with human dignity, respect, and gave them true hope. They gave food to the hungry, medicine to the sick, and hope to the hopeless. No other groups, governments, landowners, or early police came close to offering the same level of care, even though there were some level of care extended. To erase the Christian missions from Australia's history is not only dishonest, it's unjust. It dishonors the memory of those who served, those who sacrificed, and those who believed that Christ's love extended to every nation and tongue, including the Aboriginal Australians. In today's discourse, activists and academics use the term genocide not as a precise historical accusation, but as a political slogan. However, when we return to the original records, letters, policies, and actions of early British authorities, the claim of genocide does not even come close to the truth. The widespread massacre map, championed by the ABC and built by left-leaning academics, is often held up as irrefutable proof that the British colonizers engaged in systemic slaughter. But look a little deeper and the flaws are pretty obvious. Many of its claims rely on second-hand or third-hand oral accounts, often recorded over 100 years after the events they described, with no physical evidence or contemporary documentation to support them. Even the map's creators admit this and use vague rating systems to signal weak or disputed evidence. Yet despite this, the map is pushed in schools and the media as the unquestionable truth. any attempt to scrutinize it is met with moral outrage and accusations of racism. Some killings on this map did happen, but there's no explanation of why they happened or who attacked first from this map. This isn't history, it's unverified revisionism. It is true that Aboriginal populations declined dramatically during colonization, but the overwhelming cause was disease, especially smallpox, which devastated Indigenous groups with no immunity. Just as European diseases decimated Native Americans, the same tragic biology occurred in Australia. Warfare and violence certainly contributed to the loss of life, but to claim genocide without considering the far more significant medical toll is to ignore basic epidemiology. Recognizing these facts isn't a denial of historical wrongs. There were some brutalities, failures, and some injustices, like the previously stated 1838 Myall Creek Massacre. But these unprovoked, completely one-sided attacks from settlers were extremely rare. Rejecting modern myth is necessary if we're to understand the full picture. History deserves more than modern quarter truths. It deserves the full truth, even when that truth challenges the current narratives. It would be naive to believe that the rewriting of Australian history is just about correcting past injustices or helping Indigenous people. If that were the case, we'd see somewhat of a balanced conversation, acknowledgement of nuance, and room for national pride alongside some areas of regret. But that's not what's happening. The modern portrayal of colonization as nothing short of mass murder isn't just an error, it's a weapon. A weapon used by political elites, media institutions, global think tanks, and foreign peoples to dismantle the moral legitimacy of the West, starting with its foundational stories. In Australia, that story begins in 1788. So what better way to weaken Australia and its national pride, history, and values than to say it never had a legitimate or moral beginning at all? That's why every pillar of this country, its British/European legal heritage, its Christian values and national symbols, is now under attack. The flag is labelled racist, the anthem is problematic, our soldiers are condemned, our pioneers mocked, and our early settlers are supposedly shameful. Meanwhile, the government props up these falsehoods using taxpayer dollars. Welcome to country ceremonies, which didn't even exist in traditional Aboriginal culture, are now mandatory in schools and sports. Truth-telling commissions are set up not to find truth, but to validate a pre-approved narrative. This is not justice. This is cultural erasure. And what replaces it? A globalist worldview where nationalism is now evil and bad, borders are racist, apparently Christianity is oppressive, and traditional families are outdated for the Western peoples. In its place, they push multiculturalism without cohesion, guilt without redemption, and identity politics without end. For them, Australia's past must be made ugly so that her future can be remade in someone else's image. This isn't theory, it's documented in policies, education reforms, media campaigns, and we all see it. This is how nations are demoralized, how histories are erased, and how global technocrats gain control. Not through open conquest, but through internal collapse. It's spiritual warfare masquerading as social justice, and unless we expose the lie, reclaim the truth, and resist the rewriting of our identity, we will lose not just our history, but our nation, which is literally what's happening right now. The idea that colonization in Australia was a campaign of genocide is not only historically false, but it's culturally corrosive. It's a narrative weaponized not to uplift anyone, but to dismantle the foundations of national pride, to cast shame over our origins, and to turn younger generations against their heritage, against their faith and traditions. This myth, endlessly repeated in schools, media, and politics, distorts the complex reality of our past into a black and white morality tale that simply doesn't match the historical record. The British did not land in 1788 with orders to kill. They came to settle, to farm, to govern, and for many to share Christianity as the values and the belief system of the settlement. While violence occurred, as it tragically does in most frontier encounters, there was no policy of extermination, no systemic effort to wipe out a people. In fact, many efforts were made to protect Aboriginal Australians, to uphold the law, and to foster peaceful coexistence. The truth matters, not just for history's sake, but for the soul of the nation. We cannot build or regain the unity that this nation once had amongst ourselves on a foundation of lies. And we should not allow those who despise Australia's origins to rewrite our story to suit their agenda. It's time for all Aussies to unapologetically say, we did not come here and genocide a people. We came here to build. And in the face of hardship, resistance, and moral complexity, we did build. A nation that upheld justice, rewarded courage, and that was shaped by enduring faith in Jesus Christ. This is not about denying Aboriginal suffering. It's about rejecting falsehoods that twist our entire national story into one of permanent sin and evil. That's not the truth. It's trauma-based control. As Christians, we believe in repentance, but also in forgiveness and redemption. As nationalists, we believe in defending our people, our land, and our story. So let's be clear. We reject the myth that colonizers came to wipe out the Aboriginal people. We reject the lie that early Australians were driven by hate instead of hope and inspiration. And we reject the forced rewriting of our history to please those who hate our faith, our families, our flag, and our once beautiful nation. Instead, we choose truth over guilt, history over woke ideology, and courage over compliance. This is not about nostalgia, it's about memory. A nation that forgets its roots has no right to its future. So to every young Australian or any Australian watching this who has been told to be ashamed of your history, your white skin color, or your faith, we say, don't bow your heads. Raise it. Learn what happened, speak the truth, defend your heritage and faith, and walk in the footsteps of those who came before us. Our European, Christian ancestors who came here with the intention of peace and who built this country, who founded this country, and fought in both world wars to preserve this country's heritage, traditions, and culture of mateship, togetherness, and Christianity. Because the past isn't dead, it's our foundation, and it's time we built from it again. God bless Australia, and Christ is King.